Alyssa, welcome to the Easy Conversations podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm really excited about the conversation we're going to be going into, but it's definitely near and dear to my heart. And I'm especially interested in understanding how you're able to tie healing from trauma more into the spiritual realm because I do see a lot of benefits to that. But I think it's also there are misconceptions in society around it, but I think a lot of people also struggle with making that connection. So I'm hoping we can touch on that as well. But before we jump into it, I do want to give you an opportunity to share with the listeners a little bit about yourself, who you are, what's brought you here, and what it is that you're doing.
Yes. Thank you for having me, first of all. So, my name is Alisa. I am a licensed clinician at this time. I work with people with variety of mental health difficulties, struggles in life, adjusting to things. I specialize specifically on with PTSD. I work with veterans, some older folks as well that may be struggling through like, kind of processing things that they've encountered throughout their lifetime as well, which ultimately also leads to anxiety, depression, and substance
Mhm.
use. But trauma is ultimately the kind of the beginning of all of those problems. And so I like to
Mhm.
dive deeply into the roots of those issues.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think trauma is something that we tend to talk about more now, and definitely is a good thing because we obviously for many years didn't have an understanding of what trauma was. But it's also very subjective, right? So a lot of people can have, and I tend to stay away from the small t, big T type of approach in terms of
Mhm.
differentiating between trauma. My view is trauma. But there's also something pervasive I'm seeing is where a lot of people tend to identify trauma just for the sake of it to excuse their behaviors and hide behind the idea of, oh, I'm traumatized or whatever the case may be. What are your thoughts around that? And how do we differentiate that? And to me, I think the idea here is to be able to identify trauma is to give people more agency and then take responsibility for healing, not to use it as something to victimize yourself and not make any progress in life. But that's just my view.
Yes, absolutely. So to start with, we will all have trauma, whether, as you've said, big or small. We're all going to have experiences that will be traumatic in nature. And I feel like the starting point is not to see this as something that will actually take you backwards or not allowing you to progress further. I feel like understanding that traumatic experiences can be a very big blessing in life in the way of our personal development. If I'm able to, whatever comes to me, and it doesn't have to be something that's clinically described as okay, witnessing death or experiencing that or losing loved ones. There's so many experiences and events in our lives that actually would lead us to struggle, right? They will leave us
Mhm.
with scars. They will give us a lot of difficulties in the future, again, as far as our communication with other people, our own personal progress in many different areas. So, first, understanding that probably we all had trauma already by now, right? If you don't think you did, again, we have to see in which way you feel like your function in the world is not successful. If there's any areas
Mhm.
of life that you are not able to control, let's say you're not able to master yourself, something is happening. There may be roots going backwards in our lifetime and indicating that there are some areas that we need to look into and see how we can master that, how we can process that. What is the way out of this? Because again, there's always a way out. The problem is,
Mhm.
again, sometimes we like to take blame, right? Sometimes we give blame to other people. Sometimes we say, okay, that's all my fault. I deserve
Mhm.
this. That's one of the things that I also hear from people. It's not always being the victim of the circumstance. Sometimes people do take personal responsibility, but in a negative way. They attribute that
Mhm.
to, okay, I deserve that. And now this is a consequence. I should have done better than what I've done,
Mhm.
actual experience.
Right.
I feel like just understanding that, like you said, with the victim mode, right? It's very easy to get sidetracked in that direction. However, again, since we all know we're going to experience trauma or we already did, what am I doing
Mhm.
about that? I feel like every situation can open up for us a door to asking a question, okay, how can I master myself through this? What can I learn from that? If I cannot find anything to learn, that's when I get into this loop. And the
Mhm.
question is, how is it helping you? I feel like
Right.
the first thing is, okay, if I'm stuck or not, and how is it helping me to have this perception of that traumatic experience and my role in it?
Yeah, and I appreciate that because what I'm hearing from you is ultimately it's your responsibility to take, and if you're not taking that ownership to heal, then you're not really going to make any progress. The other piece that you're touching on there, and I'm sure that's a huge component, once you've been able to accept the situation for what it is, knowing that there's nothing you can do in terms of going into the past and changing it, there's an aspect of resilience that comes into play. And I think this is one huge component that I see in general, and in general, yeah, in terms of what we're missing in society today is the ability to use these situations to build resilience and actually power through. Now, doesn't mean that you just don't pay attention to what's happened or you just avoid it or you sweep it under the rug. Actually, working with those situations is really helpful and it helps you build that resilience, especially as you go out into this world. There are going to be challenging situations. Things may not go your way. You're going to experience rejection. You're going to experience setbacks, but you need to be able to weather those storms. And I just feel like often people lose sight of the value you can gain by navigating some of these traumatic situations.
Absolutely, yes. And one important moment about this, let's say, like you've mentioned again, right? We're going to have all of these experiences, not just, we're not talking about trauma, even rejection from, let's say you want to get a job, right? And you're going for that interview and you're not getting that job. If we don't have an open mind to that and understanding that, of course, there's going to be failures, of course, there are going to be setbacks. That's what we grow through. That's how we progress. That's how we get better. Because I don't know anybody that I've met personally that will say, oh my God, I grew so much through that experience when I was so happy. No one
Right.
grows through happiness. Happiness is a byproduct or the actually original state that we can be in. And happiness, again, it's different for everybody. Growth from that. We enjoy that. We indulge that. We feel blessed if we have that. But again, negative experiences are so much more an emotional charge. We experience it so deeply that it's hard to say, okay, this shall pass. This is not going to be
Mhm,
here. I'm not looking for a way out just because it feels so bad. And I feel if
mhm,
we normalize the fact that we're going to have ups and downs, just like everything, if we look back in life, probably there are so many things that we already overcame. Probably we grew so much, but we don't look at those experiences like something traumatic because we were able to surpass that. Usually, I
mhm,
feel like we attribute trauma to something that we're not able to kind of process. And probably it's true. But at the same time, looking at the reality of our life and seeing in which way we already overcame the challenges that were presented to us can open up the door to say, you know what, I'm not that powerless. I did go through this and I did go through that. So I feel like sometimes with my work with clients, I like to bring them to understanding that they already have so much more than what they give themselves, traits. And when they begin to understand, I feel like once we get into that deep hole of darkness from whatever we experience, it's hard to see that light. And it's again, when people say, okay, resilience only counts when I did it myself. Yes, but
mhm,
also you have to ask for help yourself too in order to get some direction if you're feeling lost. That's the credit goes to a person who wants to change their life. Maybe they will get resources and assistance from either professionals, other people, friends, maybe again, spiritual kind of perspective, which I'm deeper into, maybe even governmental resources, right? There can be a lot of ways
mhm,
in which if we open our mind and say, you know what, yeah, right now it doesn't feel right, but I also know I've had a lot of moments in my life where I didn't feel right. And yet certain things I was able to overcome and certain things probably not as fast or maybe still struggling with. So I feel like opening our eyes in general to those things we already have, the resources that we possess already through our own experiences. And that brings
mhm.
a little more resilience and belief that we can make it work and unfold for us.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And I do want to come back to the asking for help and tying it to spirituality in a sense. But just for context, because you're talking about a lot of the ways people can navigate trauma, you also, when you and I initially chatted, mentioned the whole idea of your own personal journey. Are you able to share that with us as well? Because that will help us tie some context to a lot of the stuff you're talking about. Because I am a firm believer that for many of us who are in this space, we tend to go through our own journey. And, I've talked about the hero's journey in this podcast many times, but there is an aspect where after you've gone through something and come through the abyss, as they call it in the archetype, you're then able to offer something to the world. So, in terms of what you're offering, what was your experience like?
All right. So, yes, I would love to share more of that. Growing up, and again, it starts a little even earlier from what I feel like we've talked about. I always had difficulties adjusting to life in general. And again, I was born in Russia and it was back. I'm actually a Soviet baby. I was born in Soviet Union when that place still existed.
Yeah.
And never finding myself belonging to any groups, to any people was very hard for me to relate.
Mm,
I feel like that's was the first step when I took personal responsibility. I said, okay, I can't do anything with where I'm born and how I feel about it. But if there is a way out, I want to try to search for that because tolerating where I was very hard for me. Again, the time it was rough. It was rough times growing up there. And so by the age of 18, I actually found a way and I moved to the United States by myself. I didn't have no papers, quite frankly, no money, no, I didn't even have the skills to speak to people about anything, right?
mm,
And so that was the first time adjusting to a new culture, not having anybody, or if I met some people, that was very unfortunate, probably for me, because again, a lot of people like to use people, especially those who come to this country. And I belong to that community as well. And another, so that was, it was a very rough period because again, there was substance use involved because I was trying to find my way as well. And I got into a very abusive relationship where I had to go through sexual abuse for a while, domestic violence. It was a very violent relationship from which, and it was the first relationship for me too, from which I had struggles getting out of. And I was
mm,
stuck in that victim mode. I was stuck there for years and learning that it's my responsibility to find that way out because the initial question was, why me?
mm,
And all of my habits with, again, alcohol. Again, I had, I'm Russian, so some Russians have more alcohol than blood in them. And I say that, I'm not saying anything bad, but it's true.
yeah.
And we're very prone to that. So for me, it was, I was just drowning in my own feelings and substances as
Mhm,
well. And so eventually I was like, okay, something's got to change. I've had experience after experience with unfortunate people and situations. And something in me, I was like, I got to find a way out. I'm like, it sounds like I'm the only one person involved in all of this experiences that are
mhm,
causing me so much suffering. It was not even misfortune, but it was suffering that I had to go through because suffering is something we choose to have. And if we're closed minded, if I don't see a way out, and again, not to say everybody has a very different way of
mm,
a time frame for healing. And for me, it was, I would say, nearly I would say like 8, 10 years. It took me a while and I was already in school. That's how I got to mental health, actually. I was like, okay, I have
mhm,
to figure out what it is in here that's creating this nightmare for me because I cannot describe it anywhere with any other words. It was a nightmare, it was a lot of suffering. I was in pain. I did not imagine when people would tell me, yes, you can heal, or why you're so negative, why you cannot be positive. To me, it was like, what are you talking about? What
yeah.
kind of positivity? So that's what led me to search it led me to search for ways to get better, for ways to healing. And it's still, I feel like certain things are still there to process. And I don't think that it will be a one time fix or even those years in which a lot of healing took place. It's still, I still feel like there are certain things that I have to work on. And I continuously search for new ways to address that. That's why I know that healing it's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen over a month, especially if you're dealing with something very big. But
Mhm,
I know that it gets much better the more we search for new options, for new solutions, and paying attention to ourselves and taking ownership for this. That no one is
mhm,
coming if you don't allow. And even if someone is coming, but you don't want to get healed, nothing will
mhm,
happen. So if to want to change, to want to heal that part of me. And then even if someone's coming to help to boost that, it's still going to be my role and my credit goes to me for allowing this to influence me because no one can
mhm,
influence us with our consent. And
mhm.
it's a very important thing to recognize, I think.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And one of the things you alluded to was this idea of being born in the Soviet Union. A lot of these things were happening before you were born. So what I gather from that, there's an aspect of intergenerational trauma. And is it fair to make the conclusion that a lot of that could have been just from the communist regime and some of the oppression people were experiencing? Do you feel like you also inherited that? And was that a part of your healing that you needed to do as well when you took responsibility for the healing? Because we tend to, if you were able to draw parallels, you probably were seeing some of these situations you were either inviting or putting yourself in were perhaps a repetition of that trauma that needed to be healed.
Oh yeah. No, I think it goes very deep. And my grandmother and grandfather actually both were alive and they went through war. My grandfather was 18 at the time of the war itself. He was a driver. And my grandmother, actually, that story is very deep. And I would like to share that really quickly. She
Mhm,
was 12 and she had a sister who was 7. And they used to live
mhm,
in Stalingrad, which is now St. Petersburg. And during the Second World War, there was a Leningrad blockade. They actually barricaded the city so nobody could leave from there. And she was 12, her sister was 7. Their parents both died and they couldn't bury them at the moment. So the two bodies were in another room in the same apartment in coffins. They were given a little piece of black bread and a little piece of boiled carrot. That was their food for the day. And she refused, my grandmother of 12, right, years old, she refused
mhm,
to give her sister to the orphanage. She was giving her the food that she was getting. She was starving herself. She decided to keep the family together. And that story, both of them survived and she made it out. And it was incredible, again, incredible strength. But I also remember how much she would talk to people about that trauma. She never, even at the very old age, she was never able to process that in the right way. Because I don't know how can people process that without having resources that we have nowadays, which I'm eternally grateful to the science, to everything, to people who discovered ways to work on that. But definitely hearing that story all the time as I was growing up as well left me with a deep feeling of despair and seeing how life used to be and now living somewhere where it was not yet very well developed. It was still a very rough kind of place to grow up in. Of course, it left that mark. And I feel like the more I understand how generational trauma works, the more I
mhm,
begin to understand why I was so affected
mhm,
personally as well, even though it's not direct, but the stories that we hear and how emotional she was, I feel like,
mhm.
especially when we have the same blood, we're going to feel that.
Yes.
Yeah, so it was a
Yeah.
very powerful experience, and yeah, a lot of folks I feel like also here nowadays, right, when I work with African American folks, it's very hard for them to go through it,
Mhm,
considering the trauma they had to go through generationally, right? So I feel like you're absolutely right. Generational trauma can be a big part of our own healing journey as well, and can definitely add to our experiences because with EMDR, for instance, right, we know that a
yep,
lot of things are formed internally, not just mentally. We're not just understanding that with our prefrontal cortex. It forms the negative neural network from the experiences we go through. So let's
right.
say if we have that generational trauma in our blood and our body already, and then we start accumulating certain things through our life, right? Then it's much easier to see the life through this lens, through this filter of already formed negative belief system that we have. And it's again,
Mhm,
it's not logical. It oftentimes is implicit memories that are nonverbal, and they create that filter through which I may even, for instance, ignore the good, positive things that I may notice, and now the negatives through in life
mhm,
or surrounding me. Even though there are a lot of different things that are happening,
mhm.
I will only see it through the filter of that despair and problems that I've experienced personally.
Right.
And if we don't heal that again, we're going to continue accumulate and reaffirm that negative neural network within our body. Like in the
Mhm.
book, Body Keeps the Score, they talk a
Yes.
lot about how it's all formed. The same thing. And you're right, probably generational trauma for those of us who experience that. And that's probably the whole world. We all had
Mhm,
certain generational kind of things that
mhm,
influenced our families. So, yes, for sure, it's a huge part of it.
mhm. Yeah, and I think just to get into it in a bit more detail too is impacts our genetic makeup too, and a lot of the times we tend to then live in this fight or flight mode and we don't understand why, right? Like the smallest thing can set us off because now our brain is associating this perceived threat to something that maybe is stored in our body. And until we don't truly come to face with it and understand it for what it is and heal it, we're going to continue to repeat these behaviors. And you see a lot of people that are perplexed and around, why am I reacting to this? So, as if it's a crisis, maybe it's not that big of a situation. So, those are those moments where you can get really curious and understand what's going on. And to your point, you obviously need to be able to ask for help. Sometimes you can't do it on your own, and sometimes you can. It really depends. Now, you touched on the idea of healing, and one of the themes that at least I was able to draw out of it is healing is not linear. You're going to have moments and days where you feel like you're making progress, and then something happens and you feel like you've taken a few steps back. But those, again, it's all based on your perception, but those are also opportunities that you've either discovered something new that you wasn't part of your conscious awareness, and now you need to also heal, or there's opportunities for lessons in general around how to navigate things differently. And those opportunities will continue to occur. And I'm emphasizing the word opportunity because that's all based on your perception in terms of how you view it. But that's where a lot of people get discouraged, where they feel like they put in all this work and effort and they thought they were making progress. And then something happens and they feel like they're back where they started or even worse off. So I just wanted to elaborate on that and also get your thoughts with respect to healing, because a lot of the times people also get attached to an outcome, which can have other unintended consequences, especially when it comes to attachment, because we tend to suffer more when we're attached to any one given outcome or situation.
Mhm. Absolutely. And we I feel like we don't trust ourselves enough. And that's no surprising because again, going through experiences that create that suffering and create despair or create pain, it's very easy to say, I thought that would be a good idea and look where I am now. It doesn't mean that the wrong, you made the wrong decision or made the wrong choice, right? Yeah, it may not bring you to the best outcome, but when we label that, oh my God, I'm such an idiot. Why did I do that? It's creating that wall. We have to
Mhm,
trust that number one, again, we're never going to be immune from things that will, again, challenge us in whatever way. It's how we address that and what we learn through that. So, number one, again, learning or relearning to trust yourself because if we think about our body, for instance, it has a natural ability to heal itself with time. If we don't touch it, we don't dig into it. And I remember this beautiful metaphor that I believe it was Wayne Dyer who spoke about it. If you have a wound, what do? You disinfect it, you put a band aid on it, and you leave it alone, right? But if I begin to dig in, take the band-aid off, start digging into it and say, okay, are you healed yet? What's going on there? Is it healing deeper or what's happening? I'm going to be redoing this trauma all over again and this injury. And the energy of us and our brain, again, with, for instance, EMDR, right? We learn that the brain knows how to heal itself if we'll help it a little bit. And the same way with our emotions. How often we feel
mhm,
like, okay, this is the worst feeling I experienced. If we look back, I remember being a child and having to be put in with certain teacher, let's say in the school that was
mhm,
very bad. And I would cry, would be so angry and sad and all of that my mom would do it to me, for instance, right? But then again, how long does it last? Then I go and I deal with it and it's fine. I move on. I continue, even with the same teacher that's creating this kind of problem for me, right? Internally, that's how I view it. So I feel like in life, if we don't put a label to it, number one, and say, okay, this is what I have to work with now. So what can I do? It is what it is. Right
mhm,
now, it happened. And again, applying spiritual perspective to it, it had to happen. And the proof of that is that it did happen, right? So it already happened. It's here. So
mhm,
then what's my next step? That's the question. What can I do
mhm,
next? And we can see incredible stories of people going through the worst experiences and yet coming on the other side and being happy and finding meaning, finding fulfillment, even though they may not have a limb, for instance, or
mhm,
like Viktor Frankl going through the
mhm,
Holocaust and still writing and becoming such an influential person in the world today, right? And
yeah,
science and within humanity, within our not only spiritual community, mental health community, right? He was a very influential figure. But
mhm,
would that happen in the same way if he didn't go through that? And in our history, but it did, right? So what we're doing with that, that would matter. And he did what he
mhm,
could, losing his wife, not having anything after that experience and going through excruciating torture for years. How can you? And some people can take that and say, okay, I am the way I am because of that. And he said,
Mhm.
I am the way I am here in spite of that. Out of it, I incorporated that in my message to the world and to myself as well. He began to heal without having to dig and say, this is what happened to me. How can I think different? How can I be differently? No, he took that and grew through that. He mastered himself. He brought something out of it, or relearning to trust ourselves and our energy and life in general, right? Getting to a place where I know maybe I can make some difference, maybe I can change. Learning to trust the energy that we have, right? As we already know that our bodies can naturally heal itself, and trusting life, trusting our choices too, knowing that there's no bad choice. The choices we
Mhm.
make just led us to the next step, and we have to address it, whether it's positive or negative. And just again, learning or relearning to trust in the wisdom of our being, not
Mhm.
just physical and mental, but also spiritual, emotional. We have many bodies within this one being, right? So
Mhm.
learning to trust it and just trust that even negative experiences have place to be.
Mhm.
Everything is meant to be in our life in that way so that we can experience it. The
Mhm.
ups and downs, the positive, negative, the pain, the pleasure, all of that. And if we give that kind of perspective to looking at our life altogether, we're never going to be blaming ourselves for what happens. We'll stop blaming other people, even though again, some things can be very
Mhm.
harmful to others. And it's understandable to have negative emotions towards that and anger. All of that is justified. The
Mhm.
question is it serving us well or not? And if it's not, because usually anger just it's only hurting ourselves. It's like the poison that continues to run through our
Mhm.
veins. And if we want to change that, if I'm tired to be feeling this way, because again, feeling angry or wanting revenge for what happened is not going to boost our healing, unfortunately. I wish it did, but it doesn't work like that because the healing comes from a very different domain of understanding and,
Mhm.
again, the desire to heal and look for solutions for where we are.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I agree with you. And even touching on the Viktor Frankl example, it's really making meaning out of your situation, and that can provide a lot of agency. And when we're talking about agency, also, there's this aspect of epigenetics that, again, you can transform. Yes, you've most people have that intergenerational trauma, as you've touched on, but you can actually transform it and change the outcome of your life by taking that ownership and having that sense of agency. And it's all about, from my view, it's all about your perspective, right? You can look at it as something that's really horrible and debilitating. And maybe you can take some time to acknowledge that. But at the end of the day, if you're stuck in that, then you don't have the ability to work through it and make something out of it. So I appreciate all of that. And then I guess to shift into the aspect of meaning, and we've touched on the whole notion of spirituality. We've talked about asking for help. And for me, just sharing personally, I think the idea of asking for help is so profound. And even in the spiritual sense, for me to recognize that in many instances I'm powerless, but looking to my higher power for guidance and strength and help has been paramount in my healing journey and in terms of navigating day to day life, whether
Mhm.
some days are stressful and very difficult and you often experience adversity. It's so important to turn to that, for me at least, to then have that understanding that, yeah, I don't have all the answers. Sometimes these situations are hard. I don't see a way out. But just that sense of humility and gratitude has been very, like, monumental in my transformation personally. But I just want to get your thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I feel like, again, spirituality also can be different for everybody, and that's
Mhm.
perfectly fine as long as we feel better through practicing that, as long as
Mhm.
we dedicate time to practicing that. Because, again, just like going to the gym, we're not doing that once a year and then say, okay, I have a perfect body until the rest of the year. We don't do that. So we can't go, let's say, to a practice that you want to tune into yourself, let's say meditation, right? You can go there and then say, okay, that didn't work, or that was so beautiful. Now I'm good. I'm set for life, right? It doesn't work like that. We have to create the rituals for ourselves to practicing something. And usually, again, coming into yourself, and gratitude is a huge one, like you mentioned. I feel like we're never grateful enough. If we really think about it, we're never grateful enough. And practicing that can create miracles. There was a study
Mhm.
conducted that groups of participants actually had to write, and I do that with my clients too, had to set 5 minutes on a timer and then starting writing all of the things they're grateful for. And not to go for big things like family, home, job, right? But going for, oh my God, like I have two thumbs. This is freaking amazing. Some people don't have that. This is great and it's so useful. Or having right now everything. Imagine all of our insides right now, all of our internal organs, and everything is functioning perfectly fine so that we can get to have this discussion. Beginning to practice the gratitude for everything in general, the fact that we're able to see today, and there's so much beauty to see, the fact that we're able to indulge the food that I want to have today. I can go and pick the food that I can, whatever I want. I didn't have that luxury growing up in Russia, for instance. You eat what you're given. There's no question. If you want something that tastes good, yeah, you'll probably have to wait for a while to like a holiday or something. So having that appreciation for a lot of things that we do currently have, even though we may be lacking in other areas, knowing that it's all temporary. If I continue to move forward, trusting myself and saying, okay, that shall pass, just like good times pass by, right? We don't trust in the positives as much as we trust in the negative. And I feel like becoming more aware of what we do have at this current moment can allow to bring into life more positives to be grateful for, to understand, to start healing with that as well. So when they conducted that study with the gratitude, people actually report better sleep, much more restful
Mhm.
sleep, and a better mood. And we're talking about 5 minutes right before bed. That's all. We all can have 5 minutes, but yet not a lot of people are practicing that. Why? That's the question. And that becomes a choice. These are the choices we should be afraid of, not the choices that create certain traumatic experiences, because they're there for a reason, right? And right now, I may be feeling stuck and circling in the same habits or routines that are not serving me in a positive way, or the opposite, creating certain toxic kind of consequences, whether it's addiction, whether it's just not moving anywhere from where I am, not taking new opportunities, not seeking help, not trying to even look within and feeling, okay, it's all hopeless. Even if it
Yeah.
feels like that, it doesn't have to be like that. And we have to think greater than what we feel at the moment. That was Joe Dispenza talks about meditation, how we can approach that. We have to learn to pull ourselves out with either our mental, and mental sometimes if I attach it to the spiritual, if I say, okay, this is happening. Can there be a bigger picture to this? That's the spirituality, like we discussed already. Turning and finding that meaning, right? There has to be a meaning for me to learn something from it. Even the
Mhm.
worst kind of experience can create within me the desire to help other people not to deal with what I had to deal with. And that was one of my own kind of ways of understanding. I'm like, there was no one for me until again the process began. And then I started seeing other parts of my own healing. But again, I have to let them in. I needed to have a
Mhm.
space where I can heal, yes, and that can be sometimes created by other people. But ultimately, what I'm doing with that will count. And I feel like for a lot of us, we have to find that motivation, understanding, or again, we have to just keep our mind open. I feel like that's where it starts.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Now, a lot of the times I hear people being cynical around the whole notion of gratitude because they're like, well, that's easier to say and it sounds very fluffy. And how do I, if my life is so bad, how do I pick out things that I'm grateful for? And I think it's just going down to the basics and even the most simplest things. And you touched on it. And I think I just want to emphasize that even as simple as saying, look at the food I have, or I have a roof over
Mhm.
my head, or I may got a good night's sleep, or whatever it is, but starting small. And people often try to set these ambitious goals or they try to do too much and then they end up trapping themselves and feel discouraged because they're not able to make that progress. So, what I want to highlight is when it comes to gratitude, I think it's starting small and simple and then working your way up because then your ability to see all the things that are happening around you changes, right? Your perspective starts shifting, your view of the world changes. And then, I'm a firm believer in the fact that your thoughts actually create your reality. And then once you're able to have that perspective shift, then everything around you starts shifting and what you perceive in the world. I mean, you can, to your point earlier, you can look at things and identify the negatives or the positives. It really dependent on how your internal state is that you see things around you. I think you can identify both. I know when there are times where, if my day starts off on the wrong footing and I'm not becoming aware of it, I am just finding all the things that are going wrong until I'm like, okay, this needs to stop and I need to make a shift. And it's crazy how it happens. And I know Joe Dispenza talks about it quite a bit too. But yeah, just again, want to put that out there and see
Yeah,
what your thoughts are.
absolutely. When we're talking about gratitude, when people say, okay, nothing in my life is right now, there's nothing to be grateful for. I want to ask you that. How can it be worse right now than what it is? Oh, I can be paralyzed. I can be not having any support. I can be so far away from my family. I may struggle with my health right now. I can be in the hospital. Oh, okay. So there are some things that you can say, okay, that's good that I have that, right? That's
Mhm,
how gratitude can start, right? If we can see that, okay, situation can be much worse. I had this, it's funny sometimes because I have my own connection in a spiritual way. And when something's happening, I'm like, okay, I'm like, can it get any worse? I'm like, then right away, I'm like, I'm not challenging. I get it. It's all good. Just to make sure I'm safe because I know they're like, oh, you think it cannot be worse? Okay, let me show you right now. So you don't
mhm,
question anymore. I feel like having that gratitude for wherever we do have can already open up doors. And again, we cannot be grateful enough. So I feel like we can find things, small things, maybe even a little bigger things, right? Even sometimes I come home if my day is bad and I see my dogs and I'm like, oh my God, this is such a blessing. Like I have these creatures that love me so much, amongst a lot of other things. But we have to learn to also create things that we're grateful for as well. And I like this example of when people, again, question whether life will really bring to you something more to be grateful for from what you already have. If you're grateful, imagine, and I think that's a very common example too, when we're looking for a car and we want to buy a car, until we figure out what car it is, we don't see that car outside. Only
mhm,
when I say, okay, I put my attention, I put my focus, let's say, I want my car is red Mazda. Okay, I want red Mazda. And then suddenly I'm driving and I see that car everywhere. What did it suddenly appear? No, it's because I started paying attention. That's the kind of perspective we're looking for, right? Sometimes we're completely oblivious to things that can actually be so good, and we can miss the opportunities, like we spoke about, to change, or opportunities of having resources that can help us to change and heal. And we just look at something negative just because I feel like that. And that's that loop we get into. Because model, right? If we look at cognitive behavioral therapy, everything that we experience will influence the next step. So something happens, I think thoughts that are negative, then what do I feel? Of course, I'm going to feel depressed, sad, anxious, whatever the case. And then the actions will be based on how I feel in this moment. For
mhm,
instance, you mentioned if I'm in a bad mood, like I start picking up on things that are wrong, the same thing, right? But when we come up and let's say I'm walking, I'm super happy. We fall in love for the first time. And I'm walking
mhm,
outside, I'm like, so great. The sun is shining, birds are singing. My neighbor passes by and saying hello. They completely ignore me. I'm like, oh, that's fine. It's all good. Life is great. It's great. But when I'm not feeling good and I'm coming outside, I'm like, oh my God, the sun again. These birds are, what are they yelling about? Then you're saying hello to the neighbor. He doesn't say anything to you. Like, you got a problem? I started going after that. You put we bleed out what we have inside. It's going to show up on the outside. And those things that may not even be triggered, they will be just because of how I feel. That's why learning to bring yourself back, meaning back into yourself and that energy, disconnecting from the mind sometimes and finding the greater purpose, finding the greater kind of state of our consciousness in the moment. And that requires skills, right? But that skill is something we have to work for. So even if I
yes.
wake up and I'm like, okay, life is really rough this week, like it's been rough and I'm struggling, there are certain moments, but I know, and that's what faith comes in, right? Faith, spiritual faith, meaning that I trust myself, I trust my energy. I know, okay, I know this is just a little bit, I'm going through something right now, but I know it's going to be out again very soon. So, what can I do in the meantime to make myself, maybe it's connecting with people I haven't connected in a while, even though I may not feel like it right now? That's okay too. But sometimes when we take that first step and we reach out, and if it's a person that we trust and we have rapport, even though I don't want to talk right now, but I start talking, that can create that catharsis because I'm doing things that I know can be potentially good, but I may not feel like it. That's when the healing happens. That's how it starts moving and shifting. We just cannot put ourselves in, one kind of box. We have to open ourselves up and try. If we don't try, there is no way we can find a way out. But if we do try, and if we try consistently and we try a lot of different things, we'll definitely find a way out. That's why sometimes you didn't. If you've tried everything, you'll probably be in a different space right now. And I say that lovingly. Again, I'm not
Yeah.
putting any blame. People have the right for wherever they are. They have the right for bad decisions. They have the right for good decisions. They're entitled to all of that. And I'm no one to be telling them what to do, but I can provide certain things that may be helpful if they want to take it. People experience changes. They experience that themselves, and that can be only experienced internally. So the more we come in, the more we connect with ourselves, the more we're able to recognize when the shifts begin to happen.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I think that connection to self or the divine, however you want to
Mhm.
classify it, is so important because if that connection, and I see this a lot in the work I do too, if that connection is missing, we'll tend to either find, I guess, manufactured forms of connection outside of ourselves, whether it's with other people, substances, some of our addictions. We'll try to create these connections. And again, those connections are not built on solid ground. So anytime you fall short, that's just another reminder to you that, again, things are not going as well as you would like them to. But when you're able to solidify that connection internally and above, I think that's when you can find the most meaning and fulfillment,
Mhm.
and that allows for your growth.
Mhm.
So, how do you tie in, just again from your view, this the concept of surrendering? Because you're talking about a lot of this around things aren't going. You tend to look for things that are positive, but you also try to ride that wave, knowing that okay, this too shall pass. But there's an idea for me personally is there is a level of surrender here that I don't have all the answers. I may be perceiving the situation as negative, but maybe if I wait a few months,
Mhm.
it's going to be something great. I just don't see it. But there
Mhm.
is that aspect of faith, as you touched on, and I need to surrender to that, knowing that my view is very limited and I don't see the
Right.
bigger picture yet.
It's great. I feel like there is one thing that I remember. It's also a metaphor and kind of factual metaphor from Wayne Dyer when he talks about how we're growing in our mother's womb for 9 months.
Mhm,
So for 9 months out of the year, no one can interfere with the process, right? We have to
mhm,
trust something out there, whatever we want to call it, like you said, right? Divine energy, universe, God, whatever people have a name for it. We're growing there for 9 months, and our moms don't create anything. They're not making a thumb or a foot or a heart. Doctors don't interfere with that unless they're trying to do checkups. So for 9 months, we all have to trust. There's no other way. We have to trust whatever process life brings to us. And then we get out, and that's where the mind gets in and ego gets in and all of that. And we feel like we know better. Of course, in the process of healing, we have to take steps forward. There's no other way. We have to. But there's time to be ahead and there's time to be at peace. Sometimes we have to take those steps. And then if things are not going the way we think, either first looking for other kind of directions, looking for other ways. Is there any other thing that I haven't tried yet? And that's important thing too, to say, okay, people say, I've tried this, I've tried that. Okay, what were you not willing to do? What
mhm,
you actually were not willing to do. You know what? I didn't want to get up early and do this exercise, or I didn't want to stop that movie when I knew I had to go to bed at night. I had to wake up early. Oh, okay. All right. So there are things that you haven't tried or you haven't done, even though you knew it was good for you. Taking that kind of ownership first and taking the steps forward towards, okay, I want to get that. Okay, what steps do you need to take? Okay, I'm taking the steps. It's not going forward. Okay, are there any other avenues that I can take? If no, maybe it's time to rest a little bit because there has to be a balance from pushing and being. And I feel like we also miss that part. So taking steps are important, but then again, allowing yourself to recalibrate if you feel like there's no progress that you can make and you've tried everything and right now in this moment, okay, let me just wait. Because I feel
mhm,
like with where the world is going right now, we're so preoccupied with that sense of urgency that we have to do it right now, we have to get it right now. It's that instant gratification. Unfortunately, healing is not an instant kind of moment. It's not an instant process. It's going to take time. And if I don't have that patience that I have to grow through practicing every single
Mhm.
day, is so powerful because we slow down. We're not
Mhm.
following for this mind. We're able to tune into something so much more powerful and deeper rather than the mind that gets constantly influenced by it doesn't matter what we watch in the morning. The addiction of freaking phones is the worst thing. That it's
Yeah.
so good in many instances, but at the same time, it's so easy to get sidetracked. And then our mind becomes running in this 120 per hour and we're not able to stop. Because if we
Mhm.
stop, we're bored. We're so bored
Yeah.
and we're
Right.
seeking that stimulation and it's distracting us from what's really important. And important is
Mhm.
to move and when to stop, when to
Mhm.
balance it out. Again, seeking for other avenues that are not influenced by the media content, by
Mhm.
face, by none of that, because none of that will probably give you the healing you need. It only comes from
Right.
internally when you connect with it and say, okay, what is that I truly need? Not what society tells me is important. What am I missing? Why am I not complete? Because we should be feeling complete.
Mhm.
If I don't, okay,
Yeah.
what's going on there?
Right. And I want to tie it to that example you shared earlier about, if you've got a teacher that you don't like, you can't. I think a lot of the times we're not willing to sit with the discomfort and we want to run from it. In that example, you are going to experience uncomfortable situations. You can't just run from it. And I tend to see that with people when they are so uncomfortable around stillness and sitting with the emotions and the feelings that we tend to experience. And if we don't pay conscious awareness to it, then we tend to run away from it. And scrolling on social media is one of those ways of running from it, right? The
Yeah.
second everyone, I feel like myself too, often I'm guilty of it, is the second I'm waiting for something or I'm sitting by myself, the default is to pull out the phone and go on and look, right? And then you're disconnecting from yourself. And those are the opportunities that we should cherish and look at, as uncomfortable as they can be at times, to get curious and investigate in terms of what's going on inside, because
Mhm.
we're constantly stimulated or inundated with information. We don't get those moments to have that internal analysis or scan. Okay, what am I feeling? Was I triggered throughout the day? What was going on? Why did I react that way? Why am I feeling irritated or agitated? Or maybe I feel exhausted and I need to get some rest. Getting curious is so important. And I think we tend to avoid it. Now,
Mhm.
the other piece you talked about, again, not on the episode, but you and I have talked about, is there's this misconception when it comes to spirituality, and people will tend to associate it with religious institutions. And then that alone is often, people have their own trauma with respect to that. And then there's obviously bad actors within that framework too that people will tend to associate and then use it as a way of saying, I don't want to associate with that because
Mhm.
of the trauma it brings forward for me, or because of some of the bad actors that have been involved. But spirituality is beyond that, and
Mhm.
I just wanted to spend some time talking about that, but also get your view.
Yeah. I feel like it also comes back to trusting yourself, right? So it doesn't matter what we do. If you feel right about it, if something in you, and that's again, we have to distinguish the mind aspect. Okay, I think it's good for me to, wow, I feel really amazing. Because again, to say that phrase, a lot of people can cite a Bible, for instance, but doesn't matter that that doesn't mean that they experienced God. Because experience of spirituality, of your own energy, God, whatever you want to call it, there's again a million names for that. But you have to feel it inside. It's not just practice and like what we've learned to see as okay, this is what you have to do, otherwise you're bad, right? I think taking that out because that works specifically with our mind and seeing, okay, I'm present, let's say in meditation or present in church or anywhere else I go. Does it feel right? Is it something that gives me that kind of experience internally that I feel more whole, that I feel more complete, that makes sense to me? I actually recharge through that. We have to listen to that, but it's hard to do it again if we're residing here in this spiral, in this space, and then in cyberspace, right? We're somewhere there in the cloud
Yeah.
altogether. We're not even present in the body. So I feel like taking the time to connect and see how you feel because ultimately I feel like all of those people that have been influential even in religious studies and religious books and philosophies, they're all talking about the same thing. You have
Mhm.
to, the answers are within. They all say the same.
Yes.
The answers are inside of you. You just have to get there. You need to understand what it is for you. So listening to suggestions, because sometimes we can be lost, is one way, and go in and experience that, see it for yourself, see how you feel. And I feel like that's where spirituality comes from. It's for us making decisions for ourselves, what feels right internally, what does, again, give me that kind of empowerment and motivation and upliftment. But it's not like we got a car and we feel happy, right, for an hour or a month or something like that. But it's something that continuously, if I come back to myself, it continuously creates that kind of sense of truth. And again, that consistency. I know that this is the truth because it doesn't change for me inside. Every time I come in, I feel the same way. I feel that kind of uplift. That's not a human understanding, not a human perception or even a feeling, right? It's something deeper, but everybody would experience it for themselves. They have to. Otherwise, my words are not going to make it true and they're not going to feel it because I'm saying so. That's everyone else's responsibility to find whatever it is for them that makes them better, that makes them feel good, that makes them more connected to whatever source they're trying to connect to. So I feel like it's a very deep internal process.
Mhm. Yeah, I agree. I think you have to trust that inner voice, and sometimes we tend to veil it through the experiences we've had in life or the trauma we've been through. And a lot of that healing is to unveil that inner voice, that or the inner wisdom, as we call it. And that is a process in itself. But the more you start trusting it and leaning into it, the
Mhm.
more powerful it becomes, the louder it becomes, to the point where that's your ally. And I think we've found other ways of cloaking that voice too. And we talked about social media, but a lot of things in life, whether it's materialistic possessions
Yeah.
or pursuit of power or money or fame, whatever it is, we tend to hide from that inner wisdom that's within us at all times. And
Mhm.
leaning into it and tuning into it is probably the biggest thing we can do for our healing,
Mhm.
which, as you mentioned earlier, is a process and it takes time and it requires consistency, but it is much needed and it is
Yeah.
worth it from my
Yeah.
perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. 100% agree with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for all your wisdom and sharing your story with us, but also some of the work you do and talking through a lot of these areas, which I think we don't necessarily spend a lot of time exploring.
Mhm.
But for listeners that do want to find your work or get in touch with you, if that is an opportunity, what are some ways they can do that?
I have Instagram, I have LinkedIn, YouTube as well. I think you can find me on Google if you put my name on it. But yeah, social media, I would say, can be a great way. Or my website is www.synth.life.
Okay, perfect. We'll put all of that in the show notes so the listeners can find it. But thank you again for coming on here and yeah, having this conversation with me today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure.